So I'm Erin Kelly, and with Phyllis Moen, I have been co-directing the Minnesota site of the Work, Family, and Health Network. And I'm going to tell you about what we did to change these organizations. So you will recall that we implemented the randomized field trial in 2 different industries. I don't think we've described those, so I'll do that very briefly here. One was an IT workforce to represent white-collar, professional, technical, and managerial positions. And one was another set of nursing homes or long-term care sites to represent some of the challenges of healthcare. I'm going to start with the end of the intervention process and say that the Work, Family, and Health Network website has these change toolkits available. So I'm going to describe a pretty complicated social intervention to try to change multiple aspects of how workplaces support people in terms of their family and personal lives while still getting the work done. But I wanted to say at the outset that the details on these are available through these toolkits on the Work, Family, and Health website. And we have constructed 2 versions to reflect these 2 settings that we studied and that can be used in similar settings moving forward. So we have STAR Office that would be appropriate for a mostly salaried workforce, a workforce where remote work or working from home is possible, and often some flexibility in when you work as well as where you work is a critical part of the STAR Office intervention. Then we've prepared all the materials for STAR Healthcare. This is appropriate, obviously, for healthcare settings, but can also provide some insights and possibilities for other settings where people are doing direct work with clients, customers, patients, so a lot of kinds of service work settings. And it assumes that there's a mostly hourly workforce, that customer interaction is a key part of the work, so working at home is not feasible for most people, and that things will probably be organized with structured shifts rather than people setting their own hours individually. So this is a little bit of a review of where we were. As Roz King mentioned, in phase 1, we were conducting these fairly independent pilot studies, and 2 sites were focusing on how we study the relationships between work, family, and health. And 2 sites, including the Minnesota site and the Portland State, Michigan state sites, were investigating potential workplace changes. And so Phyllis Moen and I were studying an intervention that targets employees' schedule control. By that I mean employees' control over when and where they do their work. So increasing a sense of latitude or choice regarding how you put your day together. Leslie Hammer and Ellen Kosick developed an intervention in grocery stores targeting these family supportive supervisor behaviors that were previously mentioned, and really targeted frontline managers to say, okay, we'll assume you want to be supportive of your employees. How do you actually show that, and how can you work on making that clearer to your employees? In phase 2, the part of the study that you're here to learn about and where the data are now being made available, we combined all of these elements. And as I mentioned, we studied an IT workforce that we call TOMO and a nursing home workforce that we call LEAF. And an important part of the decision-making here was which workplace changes were we going to pursue in the unified study. And we had promising evidence for the importance of employees' control over when and where they worked, and the importance of managers signaling and communicating their support for family and personal life. And so we decided to work on both of those targets simultaneously. So the STAR integrated intervention, I should say that when we combined those 2 workplace changes, that's when we came up with this name of STAR, has these three goals. Look for ways to increase employee control over the time and timing of work. Encourage and teach supervisors how to demonstrate behaviors that communicate support for employees' lives on and off the job. And do this through a process of engaging everyone in collective problem solving, looking at how the core goals of the organization can be pursued at the same time that employees' well-being is valued. And this is described in a couple different papers listed here. So how do we deliver this strategy? So that's what we're trying to do. How do we communicate this in very different kinds of workplaces? Here we also followed a three-prong plan. First, we had participatory workshops where employees and managers talk together about the way they work and how that might change. Second, we had computer-based training for those frontline supervisors that hone in on what does it mean to show support for my employees. And third, the managers and to some extent the employees were encouraged.
May I have your attention, please? The cause of the alarm has been determined and the situation is corrected. Please resume your normal activities. We apologize for this inconvenience.
All right, so we didn't even hear the fire alarm. I didn't know it was supposed to be affecting us. Okay, so I'm going to start this slide over in the hopes that we can edit. All right, so these are the goals of this study. How did we deliver this intervention in these two different workforces? So here we also have a three-pronged strategy for communicating these messages. The first was participatory workshops where employees and managers sit together and talk through how they do their work and how they might change things. The second was computer-based training for those frontline supervisors, communicating the importance of family supportive behaviors. And the third was a set of self-monitoring exercises to help translate the ideas from the supervisor training into practice. So a little more about the participatory workshops here. What does this mean? This means that employees are given the chance to think about how we do things around here. And this was really appreciated in both workforces. And I think especially unusual in the nursing homes where sometimes the certified nursing assistants would tell us things like, this is the first time I feel like my opinion's been asked. This is the first time I think the administrator has heard how concerned we are about a particular issue. And so more concretely, employees were encouraged to develop new strategies and routines, looking at how can we work when and where we want to while still getting the work done. And employees and managers talked about how we can support each other in making these changes. So let me give you an example from the IT workforce that we call TOMO. This is a workforce that's geographically dispersed. So there are a number of offices across the US, and they're also working with IT employees and contractors in India. So they already are working in different locations, but in many cases, employees felt like they were expected to be in the office from 9 to 5, regardless of the fact that they could have been working elsewhere, that they had already been on a call with the team in India at 5 a.m., et cetera. And so under STAR, some of the changes that were identified in these participatory workshops included a clear message that employees didn't need to ask managers for permission to work at home. They needed to think through what was required in their role, but they no longer needed to go seek permission to stay home on a Monday morning and do their work at home, for example. Employees also discussed that they no longer felt obligated to be available and instantly responsive at every moment. So for example, one developer that I interviewed decided she was going to turn off her IM, instant messaging, for 2 or 3 hours each day to actually do the coding work that was the core part of her job, rather than constantly responding to other people's questions and issues and being distracted by the IM. It was another change that was identified was that it was now acceptable within this organizational culture to sometimes question a meeting and sometimes say no to a meeting. In our formative research in TOMO, we walked in and had met a team lead, so a developer who also was supporting other people in his work group. He had a set of headphones on. He actually had 2 sets of headphones on because he was trying to listen to 2 calls, and he was IMing with some employees and trying to answer their questions as well. So this is a place where there's extensive multitasking and where people felt pressure to agree to be in a meeting, which was often a conference call, because they had been asked. So sometimes one of the things that STAR prompted was discussions about how ineffective this is and how it might be more appropriate to say no to some meetings and actually concentrate on the meeting that you're attending, and how can we get the work done and communicate and coordinate information in that situation. I want to take a pause here and describe STAR by talking about what it is not. Okay, so some ways, especially for work-family scholars, there's a lot of research on how flexibility is implemented in U.S. organizations. Most of that actually focuses on white-collar settings like the IT organization. But STAR takes a very different approach to that. And we have summarized this as the accommodation model as opposed to the work redesign model. So in the accommodation model, which would be asking for a flexible schedule or asking to work at home 2 days a week, in most cases, in most U.S. organizations, people do this because they have a specific need to do so. It's often tied to work-life balance concerns. An individual employee goes and asks a manager, may I work this way? The employee and the manager make that decision. Perhaps HR departments provide some guidance. And then this individual gets to do something that is useful for him or her, but it's still seen as an accommodation and implicitly marginalized and treated as something different. In the work redesign model, the critical element is that it's a collective process. And so the rationale is not Erin's particular work family needs or Lisa's need to do something differently, but a collective look at the way we work and how we could be more effective and healthier. The changes initiated at the work unit level, and the whole work unit goes through a discussion facilitated, in our case, by professional facilitators to prompt the kinds of conversations that I've talked about. And so our hope here is that this opens up the possibility for making a new normal, changing the way work is done, and including employees' say and latitude and input in those work processes. Okay, back to the delivery strategies and these participatory workshops that I've talked about. I now wanted to give an example from LEAF, from the healthcare industry. Of course, this is going to look different, and it was much more challenging to implement in the healthcare industry. Conversations in these participatory workshops in LEAF often focused on how we support each other, given the reality that everybody's going to have a sick kid or a dead car battery or wake up with a fever and miss work at some point, and how can we cover for each other in those situations? How can employees in work units acknowledge the realities of family and personal lives, and how can schedule changes be made as easy and transparent as possible without kind of criticizing or judging people who have those situations arise. And so in some cases, for example, a LEAF site that I happen to observe, units decided, how can we deal with an absence more effectively? Instead of switching out who works where in a certain way, how could we talk through how we could get that done in a way that makes sense to us as employees in consultation with the unit managers? Okay, the second component you'll recall is the computer-based training for frontline managers. And this training covers why should managers care, the health and business reasons that they should be interested in reducing work-life conflicts, the fact that the top managers in these sites supported this initiative. Yes, we do want to do STAR, and here's why, and I'd like you to be a part of that. Describe what it means to be family supportive in concrete ways, and really reassure managers that yes, this is going to be a change, but we're hoping you can go along with it and look for ways to support your employees. This comes from Leslie Hammer's paper for their FSSB construct and describes the 4 dimensions of supervisory behaviors. And so this is the kind of content that was included in this training. What does it mean to be supportive? Well, let's break that down and talk about what that might look like. Finally, the behavioral self-monitoring exercises included a chance for managers to set a goal about how they were going to express support for employees, family, and personal lives, and then track that over a 2-week period. We did this using iPod touches that the managers carried with them that beeped at them a few times a day to remind them to record a particular goal. So for example, a manager would choose a personally supportive goal to focus on, and a way to show support for employees in their professional lives, and then they would track that. All managers got feedback. This is a sample that you can get as part of the toolkit to show the kinds of feedback that managers got. And the goal here is to, as it says at the bottom, reinforce effort, remind managers why this is important, reinforce how well they did in this tracking exercise, and keep them thinking about ways that they could interact with their employees differently. All right, so as I've mentioned, this STAR has complex goals, and this shows how we delivered it in the office setting. So the different activities, I've touched on almost all of those at this point. The key is to emphasize how this is a social intervention, trying to get people to think differently about their work, to interact differently, and to behave differently. And so making social changes requires some time to think in between. So we did not deliver this all 5 days in a row, which wouldn't have been practical given that we were in work sites anyway. The STAR initiative in office unfolded over 10 to 12 weeks. So employees leave each participatory workshop with an idea to try out or something to have a conversation with their team about, and things can kind of sink in over time. Okay. In the healthcare setting, we have more activities, but less time overall because we're taking healthcare workers off of the floor. And so a couple customization elements here. We start and end with a special session that was led by the site administrator to try to convey that they are actually on board. And we had a steering team, which was some unit managers, some key administrators, and some key employees, so that you kind of had point people at each site who had been exposed to STAR, we knew, had participated in these team meetings, and who could help when, maybe somebody had not been able to attend a session because she hadn't been at work that week, or someone had missed a session because her unit was particularly busy that week. So you kind of had some champions identified at each site. And those people participated in a more extensive training, and then we really carefully honed how we could cut down the time that employees were off the floor, not caring for residents, but still communicate these messages. So again, ending with the workplace toolkits, these include facilitators' guides, so really detailed scripted guides for the participatory sessions, and handouts. Also includes the We Support training for the frontline managers and all the self-monitoring tools, and then has some quotes and a couple short videos from participating managers and employees to give people more of a sense of how the TOMO and LEAF STAR interventions unfolded. Okay, now I wanted to change gears and talk a little bit about the TOMO cohort. So this is the IT workforce that we were studying and some of our early findings. The goal here is to illustrate some of the things that can be done with our multifaceted data. So just to summarize, what is this cohort of employees like? They're the IT division of a Fortune 500 firm in the US. They're professional and technical knowledge workers. They have a lot of pride in their expertise and assume a lot of authority over how they do their work in terms of getting the work done. They're well paid and highly educated, predominantly white. For the IT industry, fairly gender balanced, 40% women in this sample. To be in the Work, Family, and Health study, they had to be employees, that means not contractors, but full-time or part-time employees of the firm, working in the 2 primary locations in the central US. Now, in the nursing home study, we had 30 sites, and so we could randomize independent sites. In the white-collar workplace, you don't usually have that many separate buildings. And even if you had separate buildings, they might not reflect any kind of meaningful organization of the work. And so what we did was work carefully with managers and executives within the firm to identify 56 study groups. So these are artificial concentrations or clusters of employees. In some cases, they pretty much map onto a department, but in other cases, they might not match onto a department, but be 3 project groups that really work closely together. And we put them together as a randomization unit because we didn't want group A to get STAR and be interacting daily with groups B and C who were in the usual practice control group. So we talk about these 56 study groups in our documentation. It's important to realize that those are the units of randomization and where they came from. As I mentioned, this is a 40% female, relatively old workforce, which has opened up a lot of interesting questions about older workers in our analysis. 80% were married or partnered, 56% had a child at home. Over a fifth were providing adult care responsibilities at least 3 hours a week. Mostly white, but with a large Asian contingent. Well paid. They had been with the firm a long time, an average of 13 years. And then this last comment, one of the realities of doing randomized field trials in the field is that things happen that you didn't expect. And partway through the study rollout at TOMO, a merger was announced. And so we have carefully tracked where did that happen with regard to employees' participation in data collection. And we use that in some of our analyses. As I've mentioned from the example about changes that happened in STAR, the IT workforce reported long hours and often unpredictable hours. So some of them actually carry pagers and would have to get on and deal with emergencies. And so they reported never feeling off, never feeling away from work. They had these geographically dispersed teams and were very accustomed to multitasking. So they also talked about never really getting good work done because they were never focused. Many people were coordinating with the offshore employees and contractors in India, and they knew to some extent that the work that they were doing with these people in another location might eventually mean that they lost their jobs. right? So as we prepare to work more closely with India, why are they going to need me? So the context of job insecurity was real. And it was a good firm that had traditionally had good benefits, but it was not believed to be an innovative place to work. And so the executives with whom we partnered to do the Work, Family, and Health study, the concerns that they expressed were that we may be burning out our best workers, and we may not be attracting the best young IT professionals to join us because we're not as fun, creative, or sexy as these other IT organizations. So that was part of their motivation. As I mentioned, another stressor that we take note of in our research is the merger announcement and implementation. So this shows how the study was implemented just at the baseline level here. We have the 56 study groups that were randomized to intervention, which is STAR, or to the usual practice control groups that continued on working in the ways they had previously worked. And then you can trace here, we had a response rate of about 80% for, 70% for employees and over 80% for managers. Lisa's slide talked about the 4 waves of data collection, and we had excellent retention, over 75% for all categories of workers retained until wave 4. And there was no evidence of differential retention or differential attrition by condition. So the STAR and the control group employees were equally likely to stay in the study through wave 4. Very briefly, I'm going to mention a paper that Phyllis Moen led that uses only the baseline data and takes advantage of the nesting of the data. And so this also gives me a chance to talk about some of the measures that are available, but I think I'm going to move quickly through those. You can just see we used all established scales with the exception of the single item for work hours. This paper focuses on mental health or subjective well-being, and we also used well-established and highly reliable scales here for burnout, job satisfaction, stress, and psychological distress. So in this baseline paper, Phyllis and colleagues wanted to take advantage of the fact that we have employees nested in teams. Thinking back to that multi-level figure, we want to take advantage of that triangular portion of employees and their direct managers and coworkers. And some of the key findings were that work-family conflict is patterned across teams. In fact, about 20% of the variance is at the team level. Also, this study found that the team assessments of work conditions are associated with job satisfaction, net of each individual employee's response. And the team assessments of job demands and insecurity are associated with burnout, net of individual responses. The other thing that this paper did was repeat some existing findings that work conditions and well-being are linked. So stress is higher in less family supportive when there's a less family supportive organizational climate reported, when there's lower schedule control, when there's higher job demands and lower job control. And basically we see the same thing with psychological distress, but job insecurity and work hours also matter. In the Moen et al. Paper, they then looked at work-family conflict as a mediator between these work conditions and employees' well-being. And here we see the purple outlines are where work-family conflict partially mediates the relationship between those work conditions and that outcome. And the whited out is when there's full mediation. So the key point from this paper was to help establish with more confidence that we have a set of work conditions and they work through work-family conflict to affect stress and psychological distress. We have published one intervention paper thus far from the work from the TOMO sample. Actually, this is with the This spring, we have 2 new papers. So actually, we've published 3, but I'm going to talk about the one I know best. Looking at the changes in work-family conflict from baseline to 6 months, wave 1 to wave 2. And here we wanted to see, did the STAR intervention accomplish the goal of increasing employees' control over when and where they work and increasing supervisor support? Did it reduce work-life conflicts and alleviate the time squeeze or perceived time adequacy? And then we also wanted to check, did this freedom to work whenever you want and wherever you want perhaps unintentionally stretch the work time and leave people feeling that they were working longer or that they could never get away from work? And we found increased control over when and where employees worked, increased supervisor support, and increases employees saying they had enough time to be with their family. So those were the intended benefits. We found that STAR decreased work-to-family conflict and family-to-work conflict, also one of the intended benefits. And we found no effect on work hours or intensity, so none of this unintentional intensification of work we had been concerned about. Going on from the baseline to 6 month study, Ann Kadek is leading a paper that looks at take-up. So STAR says you can work when and where you want, and then what happens? We find clear evidence that in the IT workforce, employees take advantage of this. This is the proportion of weekly hours that are worked not in the office, and that increases and is stable over time. And then we also continued this check. We do not find any evidence that later on hours creep up or later on job demands increase with STAR. And that's all I have. Thanks.